So when it comes to religion or religious art, there are various ways of defining religion that will factor in to the significance of religious art. Okay, if religion is considered according to its etymology to bind and go over again and again, it's a kind of a scrupulousness in relation to the things of the divine. Then there is an embedded or inherent meticulousness in relation to representing the divine or the sacred generally through images. In other words, it's not such took, it's done, okay? Haphazardly. Human beings, human civilizations, when they are serious about their response toward the sacred, the divine, are meticulous and exacting on themselves in particular in relation to how they represent the divine. Does that make sense? Now, postmodernity, anything goes. So I can represent God however I like, and it can be rubbish, and you could give it the Archibald Prize. It doesn't matter, right? Or the Blake Prize or whatever it is, right? And of course, people's aesthetics differ depending on, their standards, their interests, and so on and so forth. I'm not taking away anyone's, let's say, God-given right to represent God however they like at all. But I'm talking about it in a broad sense. A lot of effort went into making those pyramids, right? And those temples. And there's a reason for that. It's a serious business. It's a serious job. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. We've got some definitions of religion there that you can go through and have a look at. Religion, religious art, sacredness is a bit more general than religiosity. Sacredness has to do with how the totally and radically other to the human experience, God or the divine, and I'm speaking generally now, is disclosed through primarily the natural world. Okay. That's the first medium, the natural world, trees, mountains, rocks, bison, plants, rabbits. The first medium through which human beings have a sense of the totally other by seeing these natural objects in a very sort of, perhaps it had to do with the growing self-awareness of being distinct from that object in nature, and then not knowing how to engage with it and revering it in the process of engaging with it. So the perception of the sacred in human history is bound up with an awareness of a preciousness in creation. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's something about this particular object that I'm encountering that's different from me. I'm different from it. I'm not it, and it is not me, right? And therefore, I have to work out how to engage with it. Now, if it's a mountain that predates your earthly existence, right? Your birth into the world, and it was there before your father and before your grandfather and before your great-great-grandfather, then that mountain starts to take on a particular significance because it's outlasted generations, right? I'm speaking generally, not with reference to any specific religious traditions now, although this is a psychological reason perhaps why, well, that mountain's sacred, right? Because my grandfather climbed that mountain. My great-great-grandfather died on that mountain hunting deer. Do you see what I mean? It's going to be here after my children live and have children themselves and die, so on and so forth. The manifestation of the sacred through these mediums is known as the hierophany. Hieros in Greek is the sacred or the holy, right? Phenome, I appear. Hierophany, manifestation of the holy, manifestation of the sacred. That's the way that someone like Eliade would describe it generally. Right. Got any questions or comments so far? Speaking in very general terms now. But then we have to try to trace where the beginnings of an approach towards the sacred manifested through these media, these, let's say, conduits of the natural world, is expressed by humans using human artifice and human, let's say, technology. In other words, art and architecture, right? Because if you look at the earliest examples of human representational art, such as it was, and architecture, it's all imitating nature, all of it. It's an imitation of nature and the natural world. And that includes both mountains and streams and deer and bulls and everything else, and the constellations, the stars, right? Through which they had a sense of the seasons and the natural rhythms of the world, which is lost to us thanks to light pollution and everything else, okay? So there is an intimate connection between earliest human beings and nature, right? And that is reinforced by the astral cycles and everything else. And it's something that they will begin to represent in once they develop the technology to represent it through painting with ochre and various other, let's say, natural materials that they break down in order to be able to use them as pigments to paint and so on and so forth. Any questions or comments? No? Okay. Let's look at a broad timeline of the human journey throughout history. I know it's overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff here, but let's try to get through it together. So there are various periods that we'll be addressing just for this topic, okay? The Paleolithic period, which is characterized by hunter-gatherers and the use of stone tools from 20,000 to 10,000 BC. We'll look at examples of art that are a little bit older than this, in the hunter-gatherer period, okay? Mesolithic, okay? No, not Mesolithic, older than the Paleolithic. Mesolithic comes after the Paleolithic. Then we have the Neolithic period, the beginning of farming, basic farming, and the beginning of the use of metal tools from 10,000 to 5,000 BC. What is striking about that period is that we may have evidence for the first temples in human existence from a time when humans had not yet fully transitioned, Homo sapiens, okay, had not yet fully transitioned from hunter-gatherers to agrarian society. Why is that striking? Because if from 20,000 to, let's say, circa 5,000 BC, around there, 20,000 to 5,000 BC, human beings are always on the move. Hunter-gatherer civilizations, the females of the species usually nursing infants and taking care of them, the males hunting in the wilderness for deer and livestock for food, etc. It's impossible for them to build something using megalithic stonework because they don't stay in the same spot for a long enough amount of time. Right? So what happens when you do get a temple built by hunter-gatherers? It throws off everyone's assumptions about how human beings evolve. And that happened in the 20th century when they discovered Göbekli Tepe, which is the first site we're going to look at today, which is in modern-day Turkey, in southeastern Turkey, which is basically a series of concentric megalithic sandstone and limestone pillars that were erected. They have animals carved into them, right? So what we call zoomorphic, the form of animals, zoomorphic designs. And we have no textual evidence, of course, from that period to describe what it is that its creators actually thought about Göbekli Tepe, but it looks like a religious site. Right? So that's all very interesting. Then we have the earliest civilizations, and that's when we get to, from about 5,000 to 3,000 BC, the very first cities. So the evolution from small towns because of the development of agriculture. In other words, hunter-gatherers become agriculturalists, they become farmers. So they don't have to run around anymore. After that happens, and that happens at 5,000 BC, right? After that happens, well, you've developed irrigation in order to water your crops. You can stay in the same place for a longer period of time because you can farm those crops and eat them. You don't have to keep chasing deer according to the migration patterns through the forests, yeah? I can stay here now and I can go out and hunt and bring the deer back and we can store it because, you know, now that we've had enough time to cultivate crops and eat, we've thought about what to do with our tools, how to make them more efficient and more effective, right? So we get stone cutting implements like primitive knives to cut the meat that will then be stored and eaten. Does that make sense? Now that we can do that, we can give thought to how we design perhaps our habitations, how we bury our dead. Where are we going to house our God? And you get the first cities, which are nothing other than temple cities. The very first cities in human existence that are extant are temples. There is no other characteristic structure that has come down to us today, because if there were huts that were built around the temples of less durable material, and they've disappeared. That's cool. Don't you think? Did you ever watch Stargate, SG-1? You know, there's a bit of that in there, like the earliest civilizations as being religious and so on and so forth. That begins in Mesopotamia, which we'll look at a little bit later. It's quite an oppressive civilization. It's not for no reason that in the film The Exorcist, when the priest, Father Merrin, is undertaking the archaeological dig in Iraq, which is, you know, modern day Mesopotamia, right? He discovers that little stone artifact of the demon god of the winds, Pazuzu, and then the little girl gets possessed. Their gods are really freaky, right? It's really scary stuff. And then you move to Egypt, which is much more sophisticated and much more optimistic, in spite of what you read in Exodus, okay? It's much more optimistic concerning the gods, concerning the afterlife. Egypt is so bizarre, it's so interesting and strange that I can completely sympathize with 19th century British archaeologists who became obsessed with it, you know, when they could get more access to it during the Ottoman Empire's declining decades, and discovered all of these tombs, like Howard Carter discovering Tutankhamun's tomb and so on and so forth. It is wild stuff. And we're going to look at Egypt today too. But the most characteristic structure in any ancient Egyptian city was a temple, right? Questions or comments so far? All right. Then after Egypt begins to wane, you have the rise of a city that might look a little bit more familiar to what you and I would consider a city to be. Happens in around 800 BC. In Greece, you have the city-state, the polis, where it's hard to describe it very briefly, but we'll be looking at Greece, I think, next week. The polis is basically a situation where the geography is so beautiful and so, let's say, naturally conducive towards isolating small groups and small communities from their neighbors, that they can get to know one another and organize a society based on what we would eventually call democratic lines. Yeah, right? It wasn't democracy in the way we know democracy, because women were not allowed to participate or to vote. However, right, the men who led these little, what we call polis, these city-states, would elect representatives in a council called the Vuli, which is a senate, to periodically represent the people's interests, the interests of the people on behalf of the whole community, and so on and so forth, right? And you had various religious structures that were still important within this democratic framework, okay? Although they marginalized kings and rulers. Previous civilizations, the cities, the temple cities, were built by rulers who were considered gods on earth. Greeks, from the 800s to the 4th century, so for about 400 years, a little bit more suspicious of their rulers. The king was a high priest. He could not be a god. It's kind of like what's happening in ancient Israel, right? Because King David is not a god, right? He's appointed by God. So this kind of what we would call a, let's say, marginalization of the ruler cult of worshipping the king as a god happens in Greece and in Israel, right? But that all leads to very exotic and interesting developments in terms of aesthetics, in terms of art and architecture, especially in relation to the colonnaded sort of temples that you see in ancient Greek city-states like Athens and Delos, the island of Delos, in Sparta, in Delphi, and so on and so forth. You've heard of these cities, yes? Okay, well, the motifs and the aesthetic designs that these democratic, more or less free citizens get to think about and innovate with, and, you know, they're using marble to do all these wonderful things, have stayed with us to today, because they were popularized by the next group on the scene, which are who? The big guns, Romans. And look, they just go for it. They go, okay, all the Greek stuff is great. We're going to put it everywhere. Everywhere. It's everywhere. Absolutely. Doric, Ionic, Corinthian design capitals supporting pediments, which are triangular in shape, oculus, like rounded buildings, temple structures. The Romans get all this stuff from the Greeks and they just put it everywhere. You've been to the Pantheon in Rome? Has anyone been to the Pantheon in Rome? That's on the bucket list, has to be. You all have to go to the Pantheon. All right, so, and this stuff continues. So we've got 800 BC to 300 BC, the Greek stuff. Post-axial period, rise and fall of the Roman Empire, Dark Ages in the West, birth and rise of Christianity. Throughout Christendom, which comes next, a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman stuff is maintained with new innovations, right? Innovations in relation to places of worship in particular. Rectangular basilica-like structures that become the first monumental churches. Experimentations in design. Okay, if the Greeks and the Romans had circular temples in order to imitate the planets and the firmament and the cosmos, which the ancients all believed. They knew the earth was round and they knew the planets were round. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The Christians said, okay, we can use that, but we'll put the dome, the circle, within a cross, right? So that we can, what we're trying to symbolize by that is the cross saves the universe. Jesus on the cross saves the universe, and so on and so forth, right? So you get all these interesting elaborations that happen in Christendom. You've been to San Marco in Venice. If you've been to Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, you've seen Hagia Sophia, you'll know what I'm talking about, the Church of Holy Wisdom. You got the Renaissance period, right? You have Romanesque and Gothic and all of that. We'll talk about those. They're much more, let's say, reaching out to heaven in terms of the architecture, right? Pointed steeples, pointed arches, flying buttresses, holding up these megalithic structures that are kind of intersecting heaven and earth. Okay, the great cathedrals of Western Christendom, whether you're talking about Notre Dame in Paris or any of the other cathedrals, Sagrada Familia in Spain, these are all like that. Then we get to the Renaissance, you have a big emphasis on humanism, the human person. Okay, and the art becomes much more realistic. You don't get modern comic books unless the Renaissance happened, right? This kind of realism was impossible to achieve beforehand. And then we move through to the Enlightenment period where the Greco-Roman stuff still continues up until today. From this timeline, what you will realize is that I've taken a certain geographical context and I've mapped out a chronological trajectory. I'm basically looking at the Near East, okay, and the Eastern Mediterranean for the most part, with forays into places like France or Gaul, with forays into Spain, with forays into Germany. We'll be doing that too. But it'll be mostly the geographical, let's say, territories that we'll be covering will be mostly Italy, Greece, Israel, Egypt, Mesopotamia. And then at the end, we're going to jump to modern cities. How does that sound? Yeah? Any questions or comments? No? Okay, what have I got here? Look at this. It's a cave. Right. Some 19,000 years ago, a woman was coated in red ochre, so stone, mashed up into a kind of reddish pigment, and buried in a cave in northern Spain. What do her remains say about Paleolithic life in Western Europe? Remember, the Paleolithic period, 20,000 BC to 10,000 BC. We are already seeing the beginnings of ritualized patterns of burial. Okay, this is 22,000 years ago. Why the paint? What does it represent? We have no idea. We can only speculate. We can anachronistically, based on what later burials in the early civilizations that have a written record tell us, infer that it must have been like this for a long time, that people were being buried in a ritualized way because, you know, they must have believed in an afterlife, or they believed that there would be a continuation of this life in the next life. But we have no way of knowing. Why? Because writing is not invented until about 5000 BC. And this particular burial discovered, I can't remember the name of the town in Spain, but you can see it's adjacent to a town in Spain. It's 15,000 years older than the earliest written material that we have. Hands up if you know what the earliest written material is and where it comes from. Yep.
Is that the
Tablets, yeah. not the iPads. Pardon? Starts with C. Cuneiform. Cuneiform from Sumeria, which is the first, very good. It's the first phase of Mesopotamian civilization. It looks like chicken feet. Don't pick on him. He got it right. That's fantastic, you know. Yeah. Pardon? You got it right too. Oh, well, gosh, you know. It's not a competition, fellas. Come on. All right. So that's Spain. That's Western Europe. If you travel a little bit further eastward on the continent, you end up in France, right? Where you have the Lascaux paintings. And these are very famous, okay? They are 17,300 years old and were discovered in the 1940s. So you can imagine, when this discovery was made, it revolutionized the way that we looked at the Paleolithic period. Hunter-gatherers were considered as always being on the move. But now, for some reason, they're spending prolonged periods of time in this cave system. It's a cave system. Painting, right? Nearly 2,000 figures are depicted in these caves, all from the natural world. Equines, okay, like deer, stags, bisons, bull, people, dots, and other shapes, geometric shapes, roughly etched into the walls of this cave. Why are they there? Well, cave is protected from the elements, so the hunter-gatherers at least knew that if we paint in this cave, it's going to last. It's not like painting it outside, we can get rained on, right? But why? Something is happening in the human imagination here, which is seeking to be expressed. It's yearning to come out. Whenever an image is produced, we've looked at certain external stimuli, we've seen them, right? We've processed them in our mind, and then we imagine. Imago means image in Latin. We imagine what that might look like if we physically draw it or paint it. So there's a reciprocal process from the external stimuli through the senses into the mind, and then the mind producing an image. Now, that image could be naturalistic. It could just be drawing a deer or a goat or a dog, right? It could also be, you know, putting a horn on the forehead of a horse, and you have a mythical creature, right? There are combinations that take place there. That's very clear in some of the earliest religions that we see, okay? Griffins, for example, right? That's a mythological creature, half lion, half eagle, doesn't exist, right? But you've taken half the lion, half an eagle in your own mind, and you've represented it, and it becomes important in a particular way of thinking religiously about the world, you know? The medievals liked griffins because they thought that the two creatures within the one body symbolized the divinity and the humanity of Christ, you know, eagle divinity, lion's feet on the ground, the humanity. They did. That's why you have Christ as symbolized as a griffin. Gryffindor. That's the only house I'd ever want to be in. Yeah. I keep telling my wife that the Hufflepuffs are duds, and she gets upset because of Cedric. Hufflepuff. I'd rather Slytherin than Hufflepuff. Jeez, guess they've got some character. Anyway, so have I offended any Hufflepuff fans here? I'm sorry. Get out. So basically, have a look. Do you have questions? Is there questions or a comment? No. This is a close-up of a bison. Do you see its long horns there? Do you see? It's really interesting. According to Dr. Michael Rappengluck, if I've got his name right, those dots above the bison's head represent the Pleiades star cluster. The star cluster, okay? So they're not only representing things in the natural terrain, it's in the immediate natural terrain, but and now how they work that out, it's the exact number of dots that represent the stars at a certain period in time that are visible in the nighttime sky at Lascaux. Interesting, right? So now they're representing the universe, the cosmos. The beginnings of your horoscopes are here, you know, Gemini and everything else, okay? And that's funny from a Christian point of view. What if I tell you that the names of all the constellations and their images were used throughout Christendom? It's only the New Age which buggered up the horoscopes for Christians in the modern period. If you go and have a look at some of these churches in Constantinople or throughout Italy, you'll find the zodiac depicted around Christ at the center. Boggles the mind, right? But it's there. They were able to say, okay, they're just ways of describing the constellations. It's not a problem. We don't actually believe that they mean that we'll fall in love in the month of September if, you know, Mars is in the elliptic of I don't know what, you know what I mean? If Mercury's in retrograde, we're going to have a bad week, you know, that kind of stuff, you know. That's such a bit of fun, but it's not, can't take it seriously, right? Although sometimes those horoscopes are eerily accurate, aren't they? Have you ever read one of them? Oh, I'm just not going to look at that anymore. Okay. So, do you have any questions so far? Do you want me to just keep going? All right. Yeah. This one's interesting. That's at Trois Frères in 13,000 BC. This particular image, again in France. Okay. A semi-human figure in another cave system found in the deepest ramifications of this cave, right? 13,000 BC, 15,000 years old. Though at a far greater distance in the so-called sanctuary. So this is deep, deep down underground, this particular image, all right? It's like, how can I put this to you? It's like their own version of the underworld, right? Before the Mesopotamians really started to elaborate on what the underworld would look like. Don't forget that the underworld, before it's associated exclusively with hell in Judaism and Christianity, is both positive and negative for all other major religious traditions, right? Tartarus is what it's called in ancient Greece, and it's mostly bad for all of us here, for example. We'd all end up shades in the underworld, miserable, let's say, facsimiles of our mortal existence. But if you're a hero like Hercules, you get to go, well, not Hercules, he becomes a demigod. If you're a hero like Agamemnon or Achilles, you get to go to the Elysian fields. It's more relaxation, you know, Copacabana, sitting back and having your, you know, ladies do this. So that's the kind of thing that they envisaged, right? And they did, I'm not exaggerating. But everybody else was stuffed. Goods and bads in the underworld. Here, depicting the other world in the underworld might give an indication of where they located the sacred, deep in the earth or up high in the sky. And it can be both. And we don't know because we don't have any textual evidence, right? So you've got this semi-human figure. They call it the sanctuary. It's in a cave very low in Trois. Engraved on the walls are a tangle of animals and one painted figure. They call him the sorcerer or god, but that's modern archaeologists imposing that terminology onto this picture, onto this cave painting image. We just don't know what they were trying to represent. It's removed a little bit from the tangle of other animals and everything else that are represented there. Either etched in with pigments taken from rocks is usually the kind of painting that's, it's not painting in terms of oil-based paints and stuff like that, right? All the visitor can make out of the god, inverted commas, today are staring eyes and an indistinct shape, but the drawings show the figure in all its strangeness. So you can't, it's faded now. That's what it looks like now. Do you see? You can't make out much of it. It's faded. In all its strangeness, it has reindeer antlers and ears, the beard of a man or of a bison, round, unearthly eyes staring out at you. It's like a horror movie. Paws, perhaps of a bear or horse's or wolf's tail, and human legs and genitalia. That's what's there. That's what's represented there. Okay, but it's standing up, which is not what like a deer would do, for example. Okay, why? What do you think? I can't even want to guess. I don't ask. Why? There are very ancient religious practices known as shamanism, where human beings, these are animistic religions. Have you heard of shamanism before? Okay, shamanism, it's still around in places like Siberia and Mongolia, the Buryat in Siberia, which is part of Russia. My wife is actually from Siberia. She's not Buryat, but she's from Siberia. So she's met some of these Buryat. And then they're indigenous to Siberia. And they believe, because Siberia is mostly Christian Orthodox, yeah, but they believe that one can channel, and this is a very primitive and very ancient form of religious practice. It would not be looked upon favorably by Christian churches generally, right? Because they summon the spirits of their ancestors who inhabit them. So it's a kind of a form of possession, right? And so you have this representation, one of the earliest known depictions of a Siberian shaman, drawn by the Dutch explorer Nicolaas Whitson, who wrote an account of his travels among the Tungusic people in Russia. Tunguska is famous for what? A meteorite falling there in the early 20th century, yeah? There's an X-Files episode based around the black oil that comes out of that. So, yeah, in Tunguska, in Russia or Siberia, in 1962, he labeled the illustration as a priest of the devil, giving this figure clawed feet to express what he thought were demonic qualities. But, you know, it's not hard to imagine that if these untouched places in Siberia, Siberia was not conquered, it was conquered by the Slavs, the Russian Slavs, throughout the 1700s. And this has been kind of immortalized in some of the nationalistic paintings that you'll find in the Tetriakov Gallery in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, in the Mikhailovsky Palace, which is it's the Russian State Museum. Great art in those museums. You know, before the kind of inroads that the Slavs made, this kind of stuff was everywhere. It was untouched by the rest of the world, right? It's like the Amazonian tribes today, when somebody comes out, pokes their head, sees a camera and runs back into the, right? So it's not a stretch, I believe, of the imagination to say that they were living out practices and still do live out practices that are thousands of years old, much like First Nations people here. What do you think? Yes.
Question. So the images in the caves taken, they're very old. Mm-hmm. What basis do we assume that they were taken to be religious at the time they were known?
On what basis? Just a bit louder.
What basis do we assume that they're actually religious images?
On what basis do we assume that they're actually religious images? It's anachronistic. It's the fact that when we do finally get written evidence in the historical record at 5000 BC, when we do start getting extant, let's say, remnants of architecture, for example, out of Sumeria, it's all religious. There are lists of, you know, for example, enemies conquered by a particular Sumerian king. There are lists of booty taken in battle, but there are almost always references to God or the gods usually. So the anachronistic inference, and we can only make an inference, there's no documents, right? There's nothing. So the inference that we make is, well, it must have been like this for a long time. I think that that's very plausible. I don't think that there were, I mean, it's an argument from silence, but what else could there have possibly been beforehand to finally evolve into something like a Mesopotamian ziggurat, you know, a landing pad for the gods, basically. That kind of thinking and the concretization of that thinking in megalithic structures does not come out of nowhere. It's not just like, oh, today I'm going to build a ziggurat. That's a logistical effort that'll take decades and manpower and slaves. You know, it's not, it can't come out of a vacuum. Does that kind of make sense? I'm gonna say this just once to the whole group. Years of going to heavy metal concerts have damaged my ears. I cannot hear very well. I can still hear guitar solos from 15 years ago in one of these. So you just have to be a bit louder. Yeah. Dating system, how does that work? Very general approximation, and you'll find debate amongst scholars as to when certain epochs begin in terms of their chronological period and how long they last according to their chronological duration. I've given you a very general one, but you'll find people extending the Paleolithic back maybe to 30,000 BC. These are very much open questions in scholarship. The further back you go, the more liable to interpretation and the more fact becomes obscured by interpretation too. Yep. Is that confusing or helpful, or both? It's both, probably. Any other questions? Charles, you're enrolled via UNDA. Yes. Do you have access to Blackboard? You have to stick around afterwards because I have to. Yeah. Good. This is a recurring issue that we've had. I don't know if anyone knows, but we were hit by a cyber attack, UNDA. So they're fixing everything, but it's taking a while. Okay. Now we're talking to the birth of religion, as National Geographic puts it. Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe. All right, which means navel hill in Turkish. Navel as in the navel, the omphalos in the center of the body. Okay. I'll pass that around to you later. It's a pre-pottery Neolithic tell. So if the Neolithic period is 20 to 10,000 BC, yes, before the development of pottery. So, pottery? No pottery.
Yeah, okay.
That's what it is. I don't know. Do you want me to give you carbon dating facts? I'm not going to do that. I can't. So basically, I'm not a scientist. So, sorry. It's an archaeological mound, okay? Like a naval hill. It's a mound that these sandstone megalithic structures were buried within. The air conditioning's off, right? Okay. It's okay. No, yeah, I'll survive. It was very cold though. It was. It's hard to find the sweet spot between too cold and, you know. Oh, okay. I'll suffer in silence. I'm joking. It's fine. Created by human occupation or activity. So the sediments of the soil grow over this particular. Just don't worry about it. I'm just mucking around. Yeah, they grow over this spot over the centuries, and it becomes hardened, and that's how you get this hill forming. All right. This site is situated about 15 kilometers northeast of the Turkish city of Sanliurfa. So here you have Lebanon, down here you have Syria, and there's Göbekli Tepe. Okay. Here is Mesopotamia, where the first cities emerge. So geographically, quite close proximity to where the first cities emerge in Samaria, etc. It's been excavated continuously since 1995 by the German Archaeological Institute and the Archaeological Museum in Sanliurfa. And there are several sanctuaries in the form of round megalithic enclosures. So round, okay, look at the shape. They're round, freestanding pillars that are erected vertically. Okay, here's like an artistic representation, right? 10,000 or 11,000 BC, before the agrarian revolution in 5,000 BC, where we saw the first towns, and then later the first cities. By 3,000 BC, you have urban centers that are huge, right? What does it tell us? Charles C. Mann, who wrote he was interviewed. He was the one who wrote the article in the National Geographic expose in Göbekli Tepe. He says it's a bit like Stonehenge, except Stonehenge is much younger, comes from a later period, 3,000 to 2,000 BC. This is 7,000 years before Stonehenge. Okay. It's not made from roughly hewn blocks, but from cleanly carved limestone pillars. They are monolithic. They're not cut in the center and then put one stone on top of the other. They're huge and all in one piece. Splashed with bas reliefs of animals, a cavalcade of gazelles. Remember what I was telling you earlier about representations of nature, right? Snakes, foxes, scorpions, and ferocious wild boars. So you have both cosmos and chaos here. You've got scorpions, which have a poisonous sting, wild boars, which are hunted, gazelles, hunted, snakes, poisonous. You know, you have good and bad represented in a sense, right? The assemblage was built some 11,600 years ago, 7 millennia before the Great Pyramid of Giza, 7,000 years before Khufu's pyramid. It contains the oldest known temple. That is what scholars think. Now, have a look at some of these bas reliefs that are etched into these freestanding limestone blocks. They are quite intricate. There are T-shaped pillars. Why in the shape of a T? They did not have the letter T. We're imposing that because it looks like a T, right? Well, even like St. Francis's cross, if you like. Okay, but does the T look a little bit like the shoulders of a person, of a man? Are they anthropomorphic? Are they meant to look like people? It's a question. We don't know, right? Why that shape? We have zoomorphic, so in other words, animals depicted on them. There's a vulture here holding a globe. Some scholars think that that globe could be the sun, or it could be some kind of a solar worship. Others argue that it could be any other celestial object. We don't know. It's all inference, okay? But you can see that it took a lot of artisanship and craftsmanship to etch these designs. Neolithic, it's Stone Age. They're using stone to do this, guys. Stone. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Like, it's like, how do they do it? Well, you know, we don't know. I'm not saying it was aliens, but but you know, you can forgive some of the conspiracy theories. So, you know, they're the ones who produce shows like Ancient Aliens, right, on Netflix and all that kind of thing. Look, it's strange. It's strange because the presupposition that sociologists and anthropologists had in the 20th century was that, well, in order to be able to do this kind of intricate art, because that's art from a certain point of view. It's not art the way we see art. It's devotional, probably, but we don't know. Okay, it's devotional, probably, but we don't know. And in any case, in order to do that, you need to be in a certain spot for a long enough amount of time that you can actually develop the tools and the implements used and have the time to create such an intricate design. People don't just create something like that first go. Anybody who's good at sport or art or anything else will tell you that it takes practice. So they had the time to practice. On what? On other, you know, examples that were not put into the final product, yeah? So that's all, it's all intriguing because these are hunter-gatherers. What could have possibly motivated them to create these concentric circular, let's say, freestanding pillars, other than the sacred? That's the question that archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists of religion are asking about Göbekli Tepe. Was it a religious motivation? Because we know from Egypt that it was, in relation to the pyramids and all these other monumental architectural structures and buildings. We know that it was religion in relation to those. Can we make the inference retrospectively and anachronistically speaking about Göbekli Tepe so many thousands of years earlier? I think yes, we can. I think yes, we can, because why else would anyone do such a thing if they were not motivated by the highest ideals and beliefs? Why would they just stop in the middle of nowhere? Okay, of course, there might have been some kind of temporary, by temporary, we're not talking about a few months, it must have been years, settlement for the craftsmen to live in order to build this structure. But there's no evidence of that left. That doesn't mean that there wasn't one there, right? Because materials, you're not going to use the good materials on the temporary hut your stoneworkers are living in. So all that stuff's gone, right? And yet still, the abiding question remains that we know for a fact that around this period in time, they have no agriculture, really. It's very basic. Agriculture emerges later. So how did they stay in the one spot? What motivated them to stay in the one spot for such a long period of time? Isn't that interesting? And you get the first kind of zoomorphic, if you like, art beyond the cave paintings that we know about in the historical record. Cave paintings, and you might have, you know, the way that people are buried with the red ochre, you know, they painted the bodies and all these sorts of things. We know that even Neanderthals, so well before Homo sapiens, so we're talking 100,000 years ago plus, 150,000 years ago, we know that Neanderthals buried their dead in a fetus position, sleeping position. Why? Come on, this is all very interesting. I think it's freaking neat. Because we will never know. We can ask Jesus at the eschaton. Maybe he'll tell us. We can never know, right? That's why it's such an interesting field, archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist by any means, but you know, you can read this stuff from a theological lens and religious studies lens.